These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. As Shalmaneser grew older and older, having come to the throne probably well into adulthood and ruling for 3 intensive decades after, he fell into physical decline. Into the gap left by the king, his many ministers and governors increased their personal power. Amidst this scheming, Shalmaneser decided to appoint one of his younger sons, Shamshi-Adad, to be his heir. His older son rebelled in outrage, bringing with him a large chunk of the heartland and other cities, and the fight between the two princes lasted until Shamshi-Adad secured a final victory in 820. And thus ended probably the most interesting and significant civil war that Mesopotamia has seen since the death of Tukulti-Ninurta I. But we can't say anything more about it, since we have, at best, 4 oblique and biased references to it in all of our sources. So join us next episode as we pick up with the second half of Shamshi-Adad's reign. Thank you for listening. Or at least, that's the account you get in pretty much every history book on the subject, including the most scholarly of them. Rarely is this 7-year period given more than a paragraph on its own, and certainly no more than a page for the transition between the prior peak and into what some call the Assyrian Feudal Period, and others call the Era of the Magnates. And that's fair, there are legitimately only a grand total of 4 sources now available to us about this period. One is only debatably related, one is nothing but a list mentioning rebellion, one is highly biased, and one was only recently discovered and is fragmentary to boot. And yet, in those pieces, and in the wider context, there's actually a much richer story than is typically told. I think even the historians who do compress this down into a paragraph, a lot of them subtly indicate that they themselves have deeper thoughts about this period that they can't, fully and firmly support with the available evidence. But of course, with all due caveats, I have always been more storyteller than historian, and I think there's a fairly compelling narrative that we can weave here if we're humble and careful about what evidence we have and how further evidence could shift the details. And so we're going to go through the 7 years from 827 to 820 bit by bit. And in the process, I think we can properly understand that something truly remarkable is happening when Assur-Danin-Apli, who is Shalmaneser's oldest son, revolts against the king. This isn't just a garden variety succession struggle, but it's actually something far more familiar in Chinese history than Mesopotamian history. It's a battle between the state apparatus and the ruling house. Last episode, we looked at 2 trends which were coming together during Shalmaneser's reign. On one hand, the empire was growing and maturing, requiring more and more power be devolved to the various governors and administrators, who are commonly called magnates as a class by modern historians. At the same time, the central administration was decentralizing out of sheer necessity. We also saw those magnates beginning to big themselves up a bit more, with steady increases in state inscriptions authored not by the king, but by these governors and administrators themselves. All this culminates in Dayan-Assur, the Turton, or chief general and chief administrator of the palace, who not only leads military expeditions without the king present, but is probably the person ultimately responsible for the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, a grand and famous historical monument which records all of Shalmaneser's reign up until his grand Second Limu Year celebration, which features Dayan-Assur prominently. And some historians take from this the idea that Dayan-Assur is some sort of scheming vizier, corrupting the state and weakening it from within for the sake of his own power and prestige. But interestingly enough, there is no actual evidence that this is the case. And as far as we can tell, both Dayan-Assur and the Magnates under Shalmaneser seem uniformly competent and committed to doing their best for the Assyrian state apparatus. Now, to be fair, as far as we can tell, is not actually that much, and no doubt there was some corruption and ineptitude hidden in the gaps of our evidence. But like I said, we have 4 primary sources for this civil war, and the first of these is the year lists. Now, year lists were very important in the Assyrian government. They didn't number their years the way that we do. They had a name for each year, which is kind of like how the ancient Romans would name years by who was consul that year. There was an official called the limu. His exact responsibilities aren't well understood. It was a mostly ceremonial position given to people who were already high up in government, typically someone different each year. Now, this limu of the year seems to have performed some ritual function, but it doesn't seem to have taken up much of his time. Really, the position was one of granting honor to a certain official each year, kind of like employee of the month, but for the Assyrian government. And part of that honor was that the year would be designated by the name of whoever was limu official that year. So the year 835 BCE by our calendar happens to have been the year of Shepshari, governor of Habruri province, followed by 834, year of Nergal-Mumadik, governor of Nineveh province, followed by 833, the year of Yahalu, the Masenurabu official in the palace. But because of this system, it was necessary that there be official lists of the limu officials stretching back centuries. And these lists seem to have existed in Assyrian times, though we can only make complete listings for the most well-attested parts of Assyrian history nowadays, but back then they had the full lists, which allowed the ancients to calculate what happened and how many years ago it happened, because everything would be dated according to these lists. But of interest to us, I think that's pretty interesting, but aside from that, of interest to us today is that in the Neo-Assyrian period at least, these limu records also seem to have sometimes recorded what happened in that year, usually describing the main military campaign for the year in just a word or two. And for the period from 826 to 820, the details section of these limu lists just says revolt, something not often seen in these official listings. The year lists were an important source for the timing of everything. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be able to say when exactly Shalmaneser even died. And historians might actually have guessed that his death was in 826, a year or so after the Black Obelisk went up, just because we get nothing else from him in his reign. But that itself is interesting. Shalmaneser actually survives for the first 4 years of the revolt period, only being replaced by his son Shamshi-Adad in 822. But of course, just that isn't actually that much information. One thing we do have that is rather more suggestive than it is informative is a fragmentary inscription by Dayan-Assur himself, the king's tertan for most of his rule. And this is not just something that we infer his hand in, but that's in the name of the king, like the Black Obelisk is in the name of Shalmaneser, but this inscription is from Dayan-Assur, or at least his estate. The object was only recently discovered, relatively speaking, and itself is emblematic of the difficulties around archaeology in general. So in 2014, that's 2014 as in 10 years ago, the Syrian government identified someone attempting to sell a number of illegally looted antiquities which were supposedly unearthed by locals at a certain tell in the Khabar region. The contraband was indifferently photographed by the police officers or whoever was confiscating it, and it was posted on a Syrian government website while the matter was being processed. A year after, the Islamic State conquered the Khabar region from the Syrian government, and in their effort to destroy all non-Islamic history in the region, they posted photos and videos of themselves destroying a number of artifacts, interspersed between their videos of beheading captives and enslaving Christians and Yazidis, and blowing up houses and churches. Now, to be clear, the destruction of the artifacts is not as distressing as the terrible deeds committed by Islamic State and multiple allied groups, which continues even to this day, but the destruction of the artifacts is more relevant to our story here. Now, what happened is that the keen-eyed Assyriologist Eckert Fram, who is one of the big names in modern Assyriology, happened to notice that one of the statues being smashed by agents of the Islamic Caliphate matched the images from the Syrian government website. And by putting the images of its destruction together with its seizure, he was able to publish an extremely fragmentary translation of what's probably the most important, but because of the quality of the photographs, only barely readable, document about the entire ancient civil war. Now, to condense the whole thing down, it turns out that the now ruined artifact was a statue erected by Dayan-Assur, which puts forward another account of the later years of Shalmaneser's reign, in which the Turtan expands on his accomplishments in his own name rather more than the Black Obelisk was able to. Most tellingly, however, there is at least one passage which appears to describe the civil war, saying, in part, he caused the whole land of Assyria to rebel, something something, against his father. He seized the bow, the magnates, and governors, something something. And this section, which comes after the already known accomplishments of Dayan-Assur prior to this revolt, suggests that this section once described this story in a lot more detail. But alas. Anyway, alas or not, even just this recent fragment can suggest a lot. Now, in my own reconstruction of events, the key year is 827, possibly 826. Give all the years in this episode, plus or minus a year. It's all very fuzzy. But the key year for me is 827, when the Black Obelisk was erected. 6 years prior, Shalmaneser had been in poor shape and relied upon his governing apparatus to rule and lead armies in his stead. Now, at least some among you listening, however, will have wondered why it was Dayan-Assur leading the armies. Now, sure, he was the Turtan, but in pretty much any other era of Assyrian history, such co-rulership in the king's waning years would have fallen upon the king's son. We don't know why it wasn't Assur-Danin-Apli, the king's eldest son, leading these expeditions. As the heir assumptive watched the king lean on the state apparatus rather than the royal bloodline, it seems that maybe he didn't quite agree with his father's decision. And that gets us into our very best source on this war, though a highly biased one. Shamshi-Adad, who we usually call Shamshi-Adad V, was the king's younger son and ultimate victor of the civil war. In the only known passage of his that deals with it, he tells us that Assur-Danin-Apli was a traitor, but he never tells us why. Yes, he tells us that his brother incited insurrection and uprising and criminal acts. Most tellingly, He tells us that the elder brother had won over all the people of Assyria, both high and low, got them to swear oaths of allegiance, and pulled 27 major towns and fortresses to his side, plus probably a bunch of minor ones attached to those. That list of towns is one of the most important aspects of this whole thing, and it includes Arapaha, Arba'il, Nineveh, Huzarina, Imgur-Enlil, and Ashur itself. About the only significant places that aren't included are Kalhu, home of Shamshi-Adad and the infirm king and the palace bureaucracy, and much of the Khabar region, where Dayan-Assur was a dominant major landholder and possibly had a governorship as well. It's not quite known for certain, but we know he was over there and he was important, and we know that sometimes palace officials also held governorships, but we don't know if Dayan-Assur did or not. But anyway, the point is, you don't win that much support without having a genuine reason. Assur-Danin-Apli has won over basically the entire empire. We have no surviving documents from the rebel faction, which is unsurprising but disappointing, and so we're forced to speculate. To my mind, Shalmaneser, or someone generally aligned with the king, must have done something either genuinely bad or genuinely threatening to have caused so much of the political order to rise up against him. And this impression is only increased by the fact that Shamshi-Adad never actually says why he was right and his enemy was wrong, aside from the vaguest of statements. Indeed, the timeline makes it quite likely that Shamshi-Adad was not even initially involved at all. And so, keeping all this in mind, I want to finally get around to telling you a story. One which I think fits, and one which could be something to build on, but which we can't ultimately be certain of without more discoveries. So, by 827 or 826, Shalmaneser's decline was unavoidable, and a regency had to be put in place for the declining king. However, Shalmaneser himself had never relied upon his sons, as far as we can tell, which is kind of odd. Shalmaneser himself had been his father's top general, at least during his father's final year, and most likely had been serving alongside his father prior to this. While it is pretty normal not to hear much about Assyrian kings prior to their coronation, the fact that we do hear about the Turtan, but we don't hear about either of the sons that we know Shalmaneser did have, is actually pretty unusual. It's hard not to come to the conclusion that Assur-Danin-Apli, who was the eldest son, was somehow being sidelined, or had a reasonable fear that he might not be the one and only power after his father had passed. Now, a son being disinherited, that wouldn't be an unusual thing in Assyria. Primogeniture was not a strongly established principle in Mesopotamia just in general, and younger sons did have a viable shot at being primary heirs. But if it was just that, we would have to ask the dual question of why the revolt was so early, coming 4 or 5 years before the death of his father, and why the revolt was so astonishingly powerful. No doubt the firstborn heir of the king might have his supporters even if his father had chosen a younger son. But this war isn't just one interest group against another. It's the entire Assyrian heartland, plus most of the rest of the Mat-Ashur, fighting for 7 years against basically just Kalhu and a chunk of the Khabar region. In fact, when you're talking about Nineveh, Arba'il, and Ashur itself all joining forces, along with apparently a majority of both the common folk and the regional governors, and then them staying united and functioning for 7 years, it's really hard to understand them as the rebels here. Except, of course, to the degree that they lost in the end, and therefore are definitionally the bad guys. But really, this is the entire country separating from basically just the central state, and doing so in a way that may not have been all that bloody. Imagine that. An Assyrian event that is not highly bloody. I mean, it's hard to imagine a period like this not being full of violence. But in the early years, we don't hear anything about violence at all. We really don't ever hear about any explicit violence in the entire war, only inferring it from how the war ended, which tells us that the winning side in the war didn't actually do all that much winning, and probably didn't even do enough fighting to boast about confronting the enemy and slaying their troops, which is the usual claim when an Assyrian can't claim to have taken victory on the actual battlefield. But at the same time, it's hard from a strategic level to see why this rebellion lasted for as long as it did. The only town in the Assyrian heartland held by what we, knowing who won, can call the loyalists, was Kalhu itself. And while Kalhu was a fortified capital city, it wasn't an impregnable fortress. And even if the walls couldn't be taken, it wouldn't have been able to stand up to a siege on all sides, with the rebels controlling every major city on every major direction and both up and down river of the capital. It's likely the case that Dayan-Assur sent troops from his Kabur holdings to help hold the capital, and we should probably assume that much or all of the professional military remained loyal to the center. But whatever we assume the loyalists retained in terms of military force, both Shamshi-Adad and the later Babylonian treaty suggest that Kalhu was badly outmatched for basically the entirety of this civil war. All of which suggests, and this sounds crazy, but it suggests that the rebels simply chose not to attack Kalhu, despite controlling the main sources of manpower and wealth in the nation and a strategically advantageous position, which reinforces the idea that something very, very unusual was happening in the royal court, and that this rebellion was not just a power play, but something really unusual. To be sure, there was certainly some manner of power play going on as well. You don't get to be a Syrian king by accident. But it wasn't your typical succession crisis. It could be, some have suggested, that Assur-Danin-Apli was not actually the rebel, but perhaps it was Dayan-Assur seizing power and rising up against the rightful heir as the decrepit king slowly faded away. That would explain why the power base for Dayan-Assur is basically just the capital and his personal lands. And if he was holding the king hostage, it could explain why Assur-Danin-Apli was hesitant to attack the capital. But this doesn't really work either. First of all, Dayan-Assur is not believed to have outlived the king. And if he died in the first year or two of the revolt, why would it not have collapsed if it was centered around him? Even more puzzling, we know that other high officials were either dying or defecting from Shalmaneser's court, with the Rabshakeh of 825 being different from the Rabshakeh of 824. Besides which, Assur-Danin-Apli was setting himself up as the next king. So how much leverage would his aged father actually have had as a hostage? I mean, he dies, and now Assur-Danin-Apli just is the next king. What I would suggest then is that something in the ideological and religious order of Shalmaneser's later policies was seen by many as perhaps heretical or something not approved by the gods. And I don't mean it necessarily religiously, but this is to say, if he had done something significant with direct power implications, then those out of power would likely have resisted with force, just the way all other such rebellions occur, and it would have attracted only those parties to its cause that were threatened by a loss of power. But what if he had sparked something that's more akin to a constitutional or a religious crisis that could well have created a much more uncertain situation within the kingdom? Perhaps at his grand celebration for his second Limu year, Shalmaneser had pronounced some sort of constitutional or theological change, which, in his advanced age, seemed more reasonable to him than it actually was. The people of the empire did not fight against their venerable and pious king, who clearly commanded massive amounts of respect within the empire, but neither could they go along with whatever mad decree he had proposed. And so we could perhaps imagine that the eldest son went to the chief nobles of the great cities, the great men of the great houses of Ashur, and he spoke to each about the poor condition of his father, about how he was neither healthy nor mentally fit. He would have said that he was the rightful heir, and pointed to examples of co-regency in the past, how a son picking up the reins during his father's dotage was a familiar Assyrian and wider Near Eastern practice. They were just going to all go to the capital, inform Shalmaneser and Dayan-Assur and the others in the court that it was time for a co-regency to begin, and then the offending decree would be quietly dropped, with no one forced to lose any prestige. Sort of like an intervention. But also like very many interventions, the recipient seems to have taken it quite badly. The capital faction seems to have seen this co-regency as a usurpation. Who exactly was in charge of deciding that is unclear. Did Shalmaneser get upset and loyal Dayan-Assur backed his liege even when all others abandoned him? Or was Shalmaneser basically a Weekend at Bernie's style puppet for Dayan-Assur at this point, who would have immediately seen that such a co-regency would be the end of his power? Or were there more complicated movements lost to us in history? Anyway, that's why we're going to call it the capital faction for now. It is absolutely fascinating that Assur-Danin-Apli's faction took the rejection of the co-regency plan so well. In fact, it almost appears as if most of the empire simply ignored the capital faction's rejection and just continued on as if Shalmaneser remained king, yet had accepted Assur-Danin-Apli's co-regency. Now, nothing survives from Assur-Danin-Apli's side of the empire, which, remember, is nearly all of the empire for these 7 years. But the idea that things just carried on everywhere outside the capital, as if all was still well, can perhaps be seen in the foreign policy of the empire. You see, vassals and, loose sort of neighbors tended to revolt at the slightest hint of weakness at the core, and an Assyrian empire riven by 7 years of vicious civil conflict would likely have seen large chunks of the periphery take advantage of the opportunity. Yet while control over the far west will gradually decay over the next century, there is no sharp parallel set of revolts from all the recent conquests. Almost certainly, the capital faction of administrators and those family members attached to Shalmaneser himself were seething at Assur-Danin-Apli's hubris. How dare he effectively run the country when his father hadn't even died yet. Yet just as certainly, they were too impotent to actually do anything about it. And so, for all that this is a period which is described differently by every historian, I see this as a period of years in which the system was fundamentally broken, and yet the Assyrian state chugged along without any significant interruption. The governors of the provinces basically knew what they needed to do, and the governing apparatus could mostly look to the new, somewhat unofficial co-regent, while religious duties were probably still nominally handled by the king, who does not appear to have left Kalhu in the remaining years of his life. Dayan-Assur passed away at some point, but we have no idea when or who replaced him. Now, all this changes in 824 or 823, because for all that I don't actually think Dayan-Assur was a scheming vizier sitting behind the scenes orchestrating all this nonsense, in 824 we see the introduction of a character who very well may have been exactly that. 10 years previously, an otherwise unknown eunuch named Yahalu had been named Masenurabu, a high court official within the capital. Now, his status as a eunuch is not significant in and of itself, but the fact that more and more high offices are, in Shalmaneser's reign, going to eunuchs is worthy of note. We don't know exactly when or why the practice of eunuch officials began in Assyria, but one theory is that it may have been an attempt by Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser both to try and prevent the appointed offices of the central government from becoming hereditary fiefs. We see this very thing beginning to occur, that governorships and administrator positions are starting to sometimes get passed from father to son, and this represents an increase in power to the noble houses of Assyria against the unitary authority of the king. And this, plus whatever else the king was doing to keep the nobles in check, seems to have basically worked. The entire Neo-Assyrian period is usually classed as two different dynasties, but in fact the Sargonids are the same branch of the Abbasid dynasty that has ruled Ashur since the collapse of Shamshi-Adad's northern empire in 1700, giving it a lifespan of over 1,000 years. And that sort of dynastic, unitary dominance of a state doesn't just come about by accident. Anyway, the fact that Yahalu was a eunuch isn't actually that important. He was still almost certainly a member of an important Assyrian noble house, and even if he was lacking his own member, he was still capable of pursuing just as much of his own ambitions as his fully intact peers. In 824, following the either death or defection of Ashur-Danin-Apli, Yahalu is promoted from Masenurabu to Rabshakeh, which was Ashur-Danin-Apli's former position. And shortly after his ascension, the ailing king Shalmaneser finally kicks the bucket, making the radical transition from mostly dead to just dead. With Dayan-Assur having predeceased the king, the obvious next choice for who should be in charge is the guy who's been in effective control over basically everything but the palace for the last few years, Assur-Danin-Apli, the king's eldest son. But for someone like Yahalu, who's been at the center of palace politics throughout Shalmaneser's declining decades, this likely means his own power will be threatened. However, not only is Yahalu not in the ruling dynasty, he's not a full man, and is therefore very much not able to fill the throne on his own. So he hurriedly scrambles for a puppet to try and restore his position. And now, here again, there must have been quite a lot of drama. The main part of the empire surrounding Assur-Danin-Apli must surely now be quite fed up with the nonsense of the Kalhu palace, and is likely quite unwilling to continue humoring the central administrators now that his father was dead and Assur-Danin-Apli could take the crown in his own right. But what exactly happened is unclear. Did the main part of the nation move against the capital faction? And how soon, and in what fashion? No one knows until we discover some more texts. But what we do know is that Yahalu the eunuch got his hands onto one of the other sons of Shalmaneser, a fellow named Shamshi-Adad. We don't know how old he was. Some say he was quite young, explaining his weakness, while others say he was probably a full man by this point. One thing often claimed is that Shamshi-Adad had been named as Shalmaneser's successor way back when Assur-Danin-Apli had rebelled, but we can at least say that this is somewhat unlikely. Had Shamshi-Adad been given anything at all by this point, had he taken any part at all in defending the capital faction, it seems extremely likely that he would have made some claim to that, perhaps dating his year names as some kings did to his year of co-regency, or perhaps discussing either his or his father's achievements in the context of the revolt. But the only places that Shamshi-Adad mentions the revolt, he has basically nothing to say for himself to account for his actions, making it pretty clear that he was nothing but a ward of the palace while his father still lived, and then a puppet once Yahalu and the capital faction needed one. Yahalu and Shamshi-Adad may have lost Kalhu completely after Shalmaneser's death in 823, or he could have held on but fallen under attack. Either way, it wasn't the capital faction that saved itself, but their diplomatic ties that pulled them out of the fire. Shalmaneser had forged close ties with the Babylonian king Marduk-Zakir-Shumi, and it now seems that the capital faction leaned upon that for a bit of assistance. Marduk-Zakir-Shumi, meanwhile, saw this request for aid as an opportunity to get his powerful northern neighbor into his debt, rather than seeing it as a chance to repay Shalmaneser's kindness. And so, as the capital faction was about to be wiped out completely, the Babylonian army arrived at the last possible second. The heroic reinforcements saving the day just as all hope appeared lost. And by save the day, I mean beat back the world's most powerful army as it ground against itself in a ferocious civil war, and then put a puppet on the throne in order to help advance a bureaucratic class of eunuchs that most of the country had rejected. Again, we would love to know how it all went down, but we simply don't. Our one record of how it ended is the treaty between Babylon and Assyria following Shamshi-Adad's assumption of the throne. In this treaty, the Assyrian king is treated only slightly better than a recently conquered vassal, and the terms are deeply humiliating. Shamshi-Adad, unlike the prior 5 or more generations of Assyrian kings, and unlike most of his successors, did not come to the throne on his own merit, and it seems the entire world knew it. He was a puppet of Babylon and the eunuchs, and the noble firstborn son of the pious former king is now vanished from history, either dead or otherwise knocked from power. It's hard to pick genuine good guys out from Assyrian history, but following modern movie logic, the villains have won, and the era of dystopia is about to fall upon the realm. But this dystopian age won't actually be quite so bad as all that. We have about 80 years and 4 kings ahead of us where the empire will largely be at peace, or at least as peaceful as an Assyrian empire is capable of being, and the structures of the country will hum along relatively stably and prosperously. The constitution of the nation has changed. It's no longer a nation firmly led by leonine kings, but a nation of governors and court officials. But these will manage to be surprisingly competent, and only somewhat corrupt throughout the great Assyrian Feudal Era. We will even have the most famous and only female ruler in all of Assyrian history in this period, though whether that's a mark of terminal decline or opportunities opened up in this age, it comes down to the implicit politics of your history textbook. And so we're going to leave it at that today. Shamshi-Adad, known to us now as Shamshi-Adad V, claimed kingship over Assyria in 822 BCE, and made it into a reality with a little help from his friends in 820. He comes to the throne filled with rage, and will accomplish very little aside from the partial slaking of his bloodthirst. So join us next time as we transition out of the Civil War and into a new period of Assyrian history. Thank you for listening.